When we talk about open worlds, more and more of the conversation is centered around whether the open world actually feels lived in. But for a long time, it's been about who can make the biggest open world. Games like Dynasty Warriors 9 show us exactly why bigger isn't better, and the Yakuza series shows us exactly why it's important to concentrate on making the world feel like a world. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on Game Ranks we ask the question, what's better, bigger or more lived-in open worlds in games? To start, let's just throw this out there, more lived-in is better. If you've ever played Horizon Zero Dawn after playing any Ubisoft or EA open world game, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I know we don't normally just start off answering the question very bluntly, as we've done here, but we need to talk about the difference between these two terms and why it's much more important to have a lived-in world than a big one. Because if game devs understood this, maybe we would start seeing more lived-in worlds, meaning worlds we'd maybe like to live in more. That's ultimately what immersion is, and, well, if you play a lot of the bigger games over the last decade, when they advertise an open world, it's not necessarily that interesting. When I did the Before You Buy for Dynasty Warriors 9, I wasn't kind. If you noticed, I didn't really deride the gameplay too badly. I didn't like how they had simplified the battles, pretty much making it unnecessary to fight a boss's cadre of henchmen. But overall, my main problem was really the fact that it was set in a series of fields and paths, and that's it. There really wasn't anything wandering around, not a lot of wildlife, certainly no interesting side quests. It had pretty much all the symptoms of a nothing open world that I'm tired of playing. I don't really care how pretty it is. If it's just expanse of space, then it's not really a game. It's kind of more of a walking simulator than people call narrative games. Hey, I'm walking through a field. Maybe there will be a town someday soon. Part of the reason this has happened is because open world has become a trend. And when I say a trend, I don't mean like a fashion trend. I mean like a pattern. At some point in marketing materials, people recognize that the words big can be equated to good. So from a marketing perspective, it makes a great deal of sense to try to make something that warrants usage of the word big, or any other exaggeratory words like huge, massive, etc. These words certainly sound better than words like linear. I mean, what about life is linear? You don't want your life to be linear. You want life not to be boring, to be surprising, to have choices to allow you to go wherever you want. So why would you want a game that is the opposite? And it's a matter of language and what words sound like as opposed to what the experience actually is, because a well-crafted linear story, narrative, experience that incorporates gameplay mechanics, level design, and narrative in a very well arranged, paced, and executed manner is probably one of the more unbeatable gaming experiences you can have. But if there's something you can't call a linear game that you can call an open world game, at least in terms of sheer square footage, is huge, massive, open, sprawling spaces for you to explore. Except I'll say this, like every Tomb Raider game was linear as hell, and yet I enjoyed exploring every single one of them. They certainly did a lot in opening it up in the recent series, but not quite as open as you might think. It's still very intricate level design, and although some of the spaces are much bigger and more open, the new Tomb Raider games are still pretty linear, and yet rely pretty heavily on that exploration element. When a big empty open world game gives you a quest that you need to fast travel somewhere else in the world to complete, it feels kind of like just a thing to take up time, because it would be tedious if you walked or rode a horse or drove a vehicle. That's not to say a game that does this is automatically bad. Certainly some very good examples of open world games contain this very thing. It's just something to think about. If even good examples of open world games do something that seems to interrupt the actual flow of the game, maybe it's something that could be dropped. In my opinion, Witcher 3 is an absolute masterpiece of an open world game. It does feel very lived in. Most NPCs feel like characters as opposed to just mindless robots walking around. There's something to do nearly everywhere. The environment looks different if you run off in a specific direction. There's different towns, all of which are filled with people doing different things. Now, because it's Witcher 3 and there's so much detail put into all of this, and the open world is by no stretch the biggest ever, the game comes off good. But in all honesty, I could describe nearly the same thing and mean Dynasty Warriors 9. And yes, I am going to keep harping on how bad that frickin' game is. That's not to say Witcher 3 is perfect, it's not. A lot of the reason it works so well is it manages to hook you in with great narratives in the various quests that it gives you. Side quests often feel very much like main quests. And while the game does give you a lot to explore, it also doesn't force you into situations where you have to do a lot of it. Most places have an actual reason to see. While you certainly can free roam if you want, it's not like you're gonna miss a lot of it without doing so. Witcher 3's flaws are much easier to ignore because most of the side quests are, well, great. Another good example of that would be Yakuza. One might even call that a better example on account the open world in Yakuza games tends to be quite a bit smaller. It's not just side quests, it's quality side quests. It's activities to do. Again, in Yakuza, there's tons of actual mini-games in the game that in some cases qualify as their own narrative, or perhaps work as their own game. Obviously, if the main gameplay isn't wonderful, side quests and side activities aren't quite as important. Why do you think we're all looking forward to Red Dead Redemption 2 so much? The first Red Dead Redemption just does a fantastic job of balancing core gameplay with side quests and side activities in a manner where everything feeds everything else. There's a loop that's created when you participate in basically anything in the game that feeds you back into the core mechanics in a way that feels natural and fun, but more importantly, satisfying. Red Dead Redemption manages to find ways to direct you back towards the game. A lot of other open world experiences don't do that. They just tell you what the next thing you're supposed to do is on a list on the pause screen or something. But really, it's a matter of taste regarding how a lot of things do end up working. Some people would much rather have a list of things to do. I mean, there is a reason why people are playing games that are just that, and it's not, those people are just drones, man. Sheep just doing what they're told, being herded. Lemmings, man. But one of the unfortunate reasons that sometimes it is indeed that an unpopulated open world wins out over a very detailed one is just a matter of space. People are just not going to start making games that are a terabyte because internet providers tend to cap your downloads every month, and downloading a terabyte of data is going to work pretty aggressively towards that cap, and I know game developers aren't going to want people on their asses. Ultimately, the more grass you have in an open world game, the more a grass texture can be used. Certainly, more textures at a higher resolution are essentially automatically going to make a game look better. And as space requirements become less and less stringent through the years, as RAM gets less expensive, getting more of it in your system, or in a console for that matter. And one of the more interesting issues is that you could either use that growth to make a world that is the same size as the previous world, but with more detail, seeming more quote-unquote lived in, or you could make a bigger world that looks very similar to the current world. My hope is that we see a lot more of the former. Maybe it wouldn't be bad if for a while worlds stopped growing and started getting more detailed, started having more going on in them. Similarly, it might be good if we stopped looking at linear as automatically bad, because an open world experience that is good might be in some way linear, and it might not. But what really matters is quality. Just size is not really that big of a marker of quality either, and certainly a dense lived-in world can also still be boring. If the game loop simply works to basically direct your attention elsewhere than the core mechanics of the game, the thing that the game does best, then it's just not going to be that great. Now, in games like Zelda Breath of the Wild, certainly the emergent gameplay elements are important, but when things feel empty, unless there's a reason for them to feel empty, the player feels empty. And that's not what we really play games for. At least I hope not. I don't really like the idea of feeling empty because I'm playing a game. What makes an open world good for you? Let's talk about this in the comments. Share what open worlds you like, what open worlds you don't, why. We're of course interested in your opinion. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button. And if you're not subscribed, now would be a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and the best way to see them first is of course a subscription. As always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter @FalconTheHero, and we'll see you next time right here on GameRanks.